Okay, Chris is up from the lower deck.
Sure. Uh, okay. So our topic for this week is guilty pleasures, um, which we're defining pretty broadly, but I mean, it's pretty much any record that our friends or those of us, people who listen to similar stuff, but who are maybe snobbier or a little more narrow-minded or um, higher minded in some way might look down on or make fun of, you know, records that people shit on, but that are actually pretty awesome, at least how we view it. My first, my first record is The Exploited's Let's Start a War. Um, so I think a lot of people would probably, I don't know, I can remember this from when I was, a young kid, like 12, 13, whatever, just starting to learn about punk. Even then, people were making fun of The Exploited. But the thing is, like, the music was pretty good. And I mean, musically, this is a great record. And the vocalist Waddy is actually, he's damn good at what he does. You can look inside, you can see the band photo. I'm not sure, at least three of them actually have mohawks, which is kind of impressive. Usually it's just like most bands, there's just one guy with a mohawk back then. But it's a three mohawk band. Um, but so the Exploited, like they were sort of a cartoon, and they remain sort of a cartoon. And their politics, I mean, this was let's start a war, said Maggie one day. They were certainly anti-war. They were anti-Thatcher. Um, those things were more or less required if you were a punk band, in the UK '82 movement. Um, but I think but these guys weren't political in the way that bands like Crass or Conflict were, and in fact, Conflict made fun of them. And magazines like Maximum Rock and Roll made fun of them because The Exploited, they came off as being kind of dumb. And I don't know if that's really true or not, but I absorbed that, and it took me a lot of years to come back to enjoying The Exploited. But I mean, the music itself, um, this is a pretty heavy record for, whenever it came out, early 80s. But it's rough. This is 84. Okay. But it's heavy in the way that like GBH records from the same time were heavy, and it's fast, and the guitar is super raw. The production is pretty big. Um, the band is going full tilt, like almost like the engine's going to give out in a second. That they don't sound incredibly tight, but that's for the best. It's a really well done record. So anyway, people always made fun of the Exploded, but they put out some great albums. My second choice, Van
Oh yeah.
Halen's Women and Children First. Eric, thoughts?
Stone classic.
Yeah, seriously, right? Um, and Van Halen, they don't need me to defend them. But that said, everybody in everybody in punk made fun of Van Halen, of course. Van Halen were like the antithesis of what lots and lots of people back in the 80s, when my musical tastes were being formed, um, they were the antithesis of everything that a lot of people thought they cared about in music. They represented everything that was wrong in music, but and again, like, you could sort of say that Van Halen records were pretty dumb. Um, that said, I would argue that they were dumb like a fox. Um, there was always something clever about how they put things together, and the rhythm section was fantastic. Like, I would recognize those two guys playing together on anything. Um, and of course, Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth. It's great stuff. And it always kind of seemed like they weren't trying very hard. which was part of the charm. Like with each successive record seemed more tossed off than the last. Um, I don't know if you agree with me on that, Eric, but
Oh, I actually like that. I mean, they make it look easy,
yeah,
or there is a certain insouciance, as the French would say.
yeah, nobody did it like them. And I will never, ever, ever turn the radio when one of these songs comes on. So anyway, that's my second pick. Great stuff. And my third, um, is a record that I think a lot of people legitimately shit on, but I think it's pretty awesome. Uh, UK's soul record. This was a Prague supergroup circa 1978, made up of, I think, basically like guys from Yes and guys from King Crimson. Um, there was a lot of, there was a ton of cross pollination in that scene at the time. And this record it sounds pretty much exactly like you would expect it to sound. Like, what do you imagine it sounds like?
Well, based on that cover, I would expect it to sound like synth pop.
Yeah, I mean, well, okay, that's a weird thing about it. Yeah, it does look like a new wave record, but it's very much a prog record. It sounds like Yes, essentially. Um, and it's got that thing where it's like every song kind of sounds the same, but it's a pretty good song. Um, and anyway, you can get it cheap, and it's a fun record. And I listen to it a surprising amount. So those are my three. What do you got, Eric?
All right. Well, let's see. I have my own three. The first of them is a forgotten Pink Floyd album, it seems. Nobody talks much about Adam Hart Mother, in my experience anyway. And otherwise, I'm not a fan of the Floyd, at least after Syd Barrett was carted off to the asylum. But this one here has just all of the kind of it has the sense of humor that Barrett era Floyd had, and this is was made, I think, before Roger Waters, took over and turned it into like the greatest bummer band of, the millennium. So, in fact, I think, well, the first side of this, which is really the second side's fine, but the first side is the way to go, and it's this huge suite composed in collaboration with Ron Geeson, sort of an experimental composer, and it's yeah, this big swollen orchestral stomp or through the English countryside. Fathers shout, breast milky, mother for, funky dung. I don't know.
I
Funky
don't think
dung.
I've ever heard that record.
It's
And I'm a Floyd. I mean, I'm a Pink Floyd fan.
it sounds much like it looks. Big brass section. Big brass section. Those udders are really swollen.
Not to mention the
Uh,
flatulence. But
Oh,
doesn't
thank
Ron,
you. Not to mention the flatulence in the horn section too. Yeah, no, it's a totally bizarre record that has like tape manipulation and sound effects and all the stuff that they did elsewhere, but uh with a kind of levity that you just really would never see again. So and most people, yeah, think it's terrible. Again, in my limited experience, those who've heard it, but I'm into it. So that's number one. Number two takes us away from old Blighty and to the mean streets of Long Island. What I got here is Attila. And if you look closely at Attila, well, if you look, you shall see two gentlemen in fur coats and medieval garb in what looks like a meat locker, when what is in fact a meat locker. But this is some crazy fuzz-driven two-man insanity. Um, it's organ, going through a bunch of fuzz boxes and drums. And one of the conspirators on this on this effort is none other than, if you look closely, yes, that is Mr. William Piano Man. We didn't start the fire. Joel.
No way.
So Attila, he apparently referred to this album as psychedelic horseshit after the fact, but let's see what the company thought at the time. In the 5th century, a scourge rolled across Eastern Europe, destroying all that stood in its path. A screaming, invincible wave of destruction. It left in its wake half the civilized world in shock and bleeding submission. It was a sword in flame. It was a name that became synonymous with an unstemmable tide of conquest. Attila. So Billy Joel is embracing this kind of proto-metallic ethos of universal destruction.
Wow. But there's no guitar.
There's no guitar. And again, people think it's terrible.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
anyway.
I mean, yeah, you showed us that, and I figured, oh, okay, this is some lost proto metal classic, you know?
Yeah, and it kind of is, except minus the guitar.
Yeah,
And uh,
heavy organ.
a massive swelling organ. Uh, uh, it will just beat you into submission. And my third guilty pleasure is Inquisition. Seen here, well, this album has got a pretty groovy cover of some kind of ghastly shrouded figure opening up his cape to reveal the oozing eye that is their emblem. These guys are somewhat notorious for their political statements and hard drive contents, but they're an incredibly tight, punishing band. Just two gentlemen, one on guitars, one on drums, and they standout feature, which appeals enormously to me, but other people object to, I'd say, are the vocals, which sound like a possessed toad. Um, and they also have pretty ridiculous album and song titles. So the album is Nefarious Dismal Orations, and the song titles include uh, Before the Symbol of Satan, We Bow and Praise. So I don't know, that barely sounds like English syntax. Thrashed out, punishing music from reprobates. Who doesn't love that? Turns out a lot of people don't. The pleasure is being dragged face first through, the Arctic tundra, um, except it's not a Norwegian doing it this time.
Anyway, so my first selection is Paul Winter Callings, which is everywhere you go in New Age, you're going to see many titles by this man. I know nothing about them. This particular one has a complex backstory. It is inspired by a story he heard about a sea lion pup trying to make his way home. So he set out on a journey around the world trying to find 15 different sea mammals and either play saxophone for them or collaborate with them, play with their natural sounds. There's a lot of field recordings on here, and it's called Callings. It's from 1980, and it is a strong theme. It shouldn't be good, but it actually is pretty good. Parts of this record achieve something that would be considered contemporary classical ambient, and of that quality of maybe Wendy Carlos, Sonic Seasonings, something like that. It is held back a little bit by some of the 70s jazz stylings. But what he did is he made all these field recordings of him and the animals. He brought it back. He got a bunch of his friends to collaborate. So he's got orchestra instruments, some jazz players, and they're all sort of playing together to create these essentially mood pieces based on field recordings. So, and what's interesting about this, I was in a record store not too long ago. The record jockey put on Andre 3000, and I immediately thought of Paul Winter. And so I went back and I listened to my Paul Winter callings from 1980. Oh, okay. Second, so that was a 50-cent record. This is a $5 record called Word Jazz by Ken Nordine, who's a radio disc jockey who had a series on the radio called Word Jazz. And this is the culmination of those radio broadcasts. It's from 1957. There's something about Ken Nordine's voice and the expressiveness in his delivery that is singular and undeniably good in my mind anyway. So it's really a collection
That resonant 50s television announcer voice.
but it's more nuanced and it's influenced by beat poetry as well. So he's got that kind of cadence that the beats used as well. So it's basically the content are stories, and I'm not sure if he made them up. Sound painting, this is his term, where he's just using phonetics to express some kind of feelings, and improv beat poetry, which he does really well.
Yeah, it really sounds like a terrible combination.
Yeah, and then there's also an orchestra and an arranger that's been hired for each of these records that he would do. There's also two other records that are very similar to this. So I actually want to get all three of these so I can spread that out a little bit. Anyway, and my last one, oh, this is the one I had so much trouble with. It's like, what are my peers going to think of Sonny Bono's psychedelic record?
Wow.
This is called Inner Views from 1967. This is after, well, some of his notoriety with Cher, but he decided he was going to do this. He hired a bunch of studio musicians. So the music is really solid, perhaps too solid for a psychedelic jam, but he really plays it out. The first song is called, what's it called? I Just Sit There. And it lasts for about 15 minutes. And it's him just improvising vocals and repeating words. And there's something about his voice that's hard to get used to. Once you do, I mean, it's a very recognizable tenor, but it's strident. So once you get beyond the voice and all the vocalese that he's introducing into the music, it's actually quite listenable. Most of the rest of the record, I mean, that first song is like a hippie jam. Most of the rest of it is elongated folk rock, not unlike the Doors or something like that. 1967 was the summer of love, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Whether you were in San Francisco or LA, you were doing it. You were indulging in that kind of music. And I've listened to it about 10 times, and I finally realized something. That first really long song, he's copying the melody from the Beatles' A Day in the Life. I read the news today, oh boy. That one. So he's used that melody and deconstructing it throughout this very long song. And that's it for me. Anybody want to sing The Day in the Life with me?
I think scrotal would be a good quality for the vocals.